This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
If your fashion wish list lives rent-free in your brain, you need to be on Poshmark. With Poshmark, you're shopping millions of listings from thousands of closets, each curated by someone with their own style. Vintage finds, designer pieces, and everyday staples all in one place. Search for your favorites or let the discovery come to you. Poshmark makes it easy to find what you actually want to wear at prices that feel like a quiet win. Download the Poshmark app today and use code PODCAST10 when you sign up to get $10 off your first purchase.
Well, hello again. This is Mark from the Swamp School. And this week, we're going to be going over, in this episode, the concepts of mitigation types. In one of our last podcasts, we had gone over kind of an overview of mitigation banking, and I said I would go over the mitigation types. So what are the mitigation types? Essentially, there are four major categories. The four categories are restoration, creation, enhancement, and preservation. And each one of these has a role. The idea behind this is that this is what you're doing to the site to make it back into a wetland. And there's a lot of different types of wetlands out there. So we're not talking the same as wetland, like cattail marsh versus forest versus anything like that. Essentially, what you're looking at is a type of wetland from just essentially the construction techniques. And that's the way we're looking at it. The issue there is that the Army Corps of Engineers will issue credits in the IRT, will issue credits. So it's not just the Army Corps. The Army Corps is the chair of the IRT, by the way. They're not necessarily the only one going to give you, grief on this. Essentially, there's many other components, the EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service and so forth. But the idea essentially is that you're going to agree on credit ratios. What happens is that the permittee, that's the one that's going to fill in a wetland somewhere else and has nothing to do with your project, but they're going to be coming to the Army Corps looking to fill in a wetland, and they're going to ask for a permit. And based upon the wetland type, and the Corps kind of splits hairs with this. A lot of there was a big push a while back about what they called riverine wetlands or riparian wetlands. I think it was riparian was the better word. Riparian wetlands versus non-riparian wetlands. And the idea is that basically wetlands associated with streams versus wetlands that were kind of isolated, which now we're not even sure if we're regulated anymore. So I'm not sure what to do with those. But the idea is that forested wetlands versus non-forested wetlands versus emergent marshes versus all different wetland types are very, very hard to replace because it takes a long time to grow a forest. And the reality is that if you're a mitigation banker and you're building a wetland, you're basically going to be putting up a bunch of really teeny tiny trees. Even if it's going to be a forest, they're going to be, basically, hopefully not the bare root stock. Those are terrible things to use for a mitigation bank, but at least containerized, 2-gallon containers, something like that, some containerized trees, maybe a 1/2-inch diameter, tree. And it's going to take, decades for them to be to the same size and girth and so forth as the wetland that was impacted if it's a forested one. So they don't really focus on that. They kind of acknowledge the fact that the wetland that you're going to be replacing is not going to have the same kind of ecological value as the one that was impacted. But they are going to be looking at kind of a history of the site. And this is a little bit odd. I don't know that I entirely agree with the rationale on this because it has to do with risk management. And that's really the issue. The problem is that wetland mitigation has had sort of a checkered history on whether or not it's been successful. Have they been able to put back a wetland? We just said that, the wetland we're going to be putting back isn't as good as the one that was impacted, and we accept that. But what about its being a wetland at all? And that's been one of the biggest problems. There have been many projects involving millions of dollars that were totally unsuccessful, just did not work. They were not wetlands. They didn't provide wetland, ecology. They didn't provide any of that required aspects of it, and yet spent millions of dollars on this and didn't end up with a wetland. Well, the idea behind a wetland is the reason a wetland is wet, a wetland, is because it's wet. So the idea there is it's a wet land. And you need water to make that happen. You need the water to come in, and it has to stay there for a while before it leaves. It will eventually leave one way or another, but it's going to stay there for a while. But you got to be careful because there's a balancing act between too much water and too little water. And that's the essence of what's known as a water budget. So, which is a topic for another day. We've got a lot of nuances to this. So the idea basically is that the riskier sites are the ones that get the least credit because they're more likely to fail, and therefore they want to have more of it. And the idea is more is better. So if we have a less risky site, we don't need as much. And if we have a really risky site, we need a whole lot. And that works up to a point. And then we get into the idea of preservation, which is it's a wetland already, which I never understood why they usually gets the worst. So the ratios on this vary from state to state. And again, it's a function of the IRT. Some of them deal with it on a statewide basis. The Corps has kind of a general rule of thumb. And going back to its 1998 guidance document that came out on this and the regulations that were promulgated resulting from that, they had a minimum have to replace at least 2 acres of wetlands or 2 units of wetlands for every 1 wetland unit lost. So there's a 2-to-1 ratio at a minimum. Now, depending upon how you arrive at your numbers, that is just generally mitigation. So you have to mitigate at a 2-to-1 ratio. But it's usually converted to this concept of credit. So it's 1 credit impact to 2 credits mitigation. Well, what's a credit? And a credit is a function of the mitigation type. And again, restoration, creation, enhancement, and preservation are usually the ones that we're referring to. So for example, restoration, you might have a, say, I don't know, 2-to-1 ratio. And so for every credit that you generate, you need 2 acres of restoration to get 1 credit. And again, you're going to need 2 credits. So you're actually getting 4 acres of restoration for every acre of impact is the way that ends up working out if you do the actual credit math. So that's restoration. Creation is going to be considered more risky because the issue with creation is it never was a wetland before. And so the issue with restoration is the site used to be a wetland. You can document beyond a shadow of a doubt that it used to be a wetland and now it's not. And that's usually because the hydrology has been cut off. And again, back to the water, wetland. So we're going to just restore the water back in. So maybe there was a ditch that was plugged or something like that, and you're just going to let the water back in. So that should be easy, and it should be relatively successful. So this is the least risky. Creation is considered more risky because the site has not been ever known to have been a wetland. And now you're making a wetland basically out of nothing. Personally, I like these the best because I have the most control over the site. One of the issues with restoration, this is a little side note here, one of the things with restoration is why isn't it a wetland anymore is never really focused on. And it's just simply, let's turn it back into a wetland, but nobody really gets into the question of why isn't it a wetland anymore? And sometimes those issues are hidden and you don't realize them until you're well into construction and you've already messed up and you spent a lot of money. So it's a problem. So restoration is, to me, in my mind, more risky, but according to the Army Corps of Engineers, less risky. So to that end, we'll go to creation, and a lot of times creation will be a 3 or 4-to-1 ratio. Again, so for every acre of impact, you're going to have 3 or 4 acres of creation. And creation is going to be a lot of engineering, a lot of design. You're going to have to dig holes, things like that. So there's presumably more work related with creation. So you're going to have to create the bowl to put the water in. But again, you have complete control over all the variables, which is why I like creation sites better than restoration sites. But that's just me. The other one that we look at is enhancement. Now, enhancement is a degraded wetland. It is a wetland. It meets the 3 criteria to call it a wetland. It is a wetland. However, there's problems. Maybe it's invasive species. Maybe there's problems with, flooding or not flooding or some weird aspect of the site, and we can tweak it a little bit and make it a nice wetland. And so that is actually a low risk in terms of hydraulics, but because we're not doing a lot, they tend to hit us with like a 5 or 6-to-1 ratio on that. So they want more of it in order to basically meet their no net loss approach on this, which is what they're going for. And then finally is the preservation. Now, preservation is a wetland. You aren't going to do anything to it. There's no plan, so you're not enhancing it. Mainly, all you're really doing is possibly preventing access, putting it in a conservation easement, preventing it from being put on the slate of potential sites to be built upon. But that's about it. Now, presumably, if there are rules and laws in place already, then you're not really accomplishing even all that much. But generally, with the preservation site, you're looking at like a 10-to-1 ratio. So that's a lot of acres. Now, as a general rule, now with the 10-to-1, I mentioned the 2-to-1 ratio. A lot of times, what the Corps of Engineers requires is that if you're looking at a 2-to-1 ratio, that they have to meet as a minimum, one of those credits has to be at least a restoration or creation credit, because this addresses the no net loss concept. So you got at least putting back what you took, so there's no net loss. The second credit can be enhancement or preservation, and that's how you get that other credit. So the idea is that with enhancement and preservation, you're not adding to the footprint of the world any additional wetlands. You're not changing the numbers. You're just simply working with the existing wetland. So to that end, you basically have to have one restoration or creation credit to one, and one. You could also add one preservation or basically enhancement credit as well. Or you could have two restoration credits. You get into the math. There's a lot of different combinations. But at a minimum, you have to put back a wetland if you take a wetland, and that's what they're trying to accomplish. So that's a little high-level view of that. And essentially, once you've established that, then you basically come up with how many impact credits and so forth, and then the numbers that go along with it. Presumably, the restoration is one of the cheaper ones to do. Creation is the most expensive to do, presumably. Those two kind of go neck and neck on price. Enhancement's a little bit cheaper, and presumably the preservation, because you're really not doing anything, there should be the least amount of construction costs, mostly just legal fees to put up conservation easements and things, and maybe even a fence or something. But that's about it. So it's the cheapest to do, but it requires the most land. So you end up with kind of hopefully offsetting that cost. So at any rate, that wraps up a quick discussion on the wetland types that are basically eligible for, or the wetland mitigation types that are eligible for mitigation and for your mitigation bank. So I hope that was helpful, and we will come up with some new and exciting topics as we go along with this podcast. So with that, I wish you a good day, and I hope to see you in the swamp. Take care.